And what's I think interesting in the last 2 3 years specifically, but I would say more so in the last year, very much so, is the pendulum switch back towards Bitcoin, where we've seen a lot of the application space, the DeFi space, NFTs, all leverage Ethereum. We're now seeing the pendulum switch back to how can we move Bitcoin from really just a peer-to-peer, more token transfer ecosystem to a value creation system. So Bitcoin is kind of catching up to the rest of the blockchain ecosystem, but now much stronger than before because that's where all the liquidity is.
Quick one, nothing here is financial advice. It's for entertainment and educational purposes only. Always do your own research or speak to a financial advisor before making any investment decisions. Enjoy the episode and like and subscribe.
GM, welcome back, everyone. Founder series, got awesome guests. It's the Battle of the Beards. Founder of exSat, Bitcoin DeFi narrative. It's all happening, obviously, in the Bitcoin space at the moment. Really cool to have you, sir. Welcome. It's been a while.
Likewise.
Been a while to
Yeah.
get you on. I know you're super busy. You guys are doing amazing things. Thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. I mean, I've got the samurai beard, but you've got the Jedi beard.
Yeah.
So I think this is going to be an interesting show. Thank you very much for having me on. This should be fun.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, and yeah, I mean, I think obviously just jumping right into it, just before we get into what you guys are doing on the Bitcoin side of it, just quick intro, what your kind of origin story is in crypto. I know that just before the call, you were talking about being in crypto since 2010, so proper OG. Even more stoked to have you on now. But yeah, give us a quick intro in terms of your path and what's brought you here today.
Sure. So I started mining Bitcoin in 2010, really early on, mining on my laptop. At the time, what really got me into the blockchain space wasn't even the Bitcoin white paper in the beginning. It was actually protein folding. If you remember, around that period of time, it was just the same general idea of contributing to a mining pool. Essentially, you're computing power to be able to do something in return and benefit something of greater nature in return. If this decentralized spirit of people that don't know each other all around the world contributing to something. And that's really what got me into it in the beginning. It wasn't the financial aspect of it. I then read the white paper, and that was pretty cool. I thought the technical component of it, of being able to do trustless transfers between different individuals that don't necessarily need to know each other, I thought that was awesome. So that's really what brought me into it in the beginning. It wasn't the peer-to-peer cash component of things. And I must admit that if I would have focused on that more, and if that would have maybe triggered a little bit more, I might have more Bitcoin than I do, and I would have kept the ones from that period of time. But I did mine for a period of time. And then I left the space. Essentially, life took its course. Started working for the federal government in Canada. I was working as a behavioral economist. Did a couple of things, and eventually, the blockchain ecosystem came back calling. 2016, 2017 is when I really jumped in full time. Left traditional employment and got into the space and basically been working and advancing this space now for the last, give or take, 6 years full time. That leads me now to exSat, which is kind of the culmination of all of that work for the last 6 years, give or take. And just seeing the space evolve over time as well, the use cases, um, you know, really, because I've been here for so long, I've seen where we kind of came from and what it was in the beginning, where we are, and so it gives me an idea of where we can go. And that's really what excites me, is how I can contribute to where we're going as an overall ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, so you would be kind of like very, very well positioned to speak about, what was and what the idea of Bitcoin was to what it is now. And I know that it's kind of like going a little bit left field here, but I mean, how do you feel about, the start of the whole thing, the idea that we had around kind of peer to peer, and it was essentially like a payment thing, and now it's digital gold from that perspective. I mean, just purely from like a hardcore Bitcoin perspective. I mean, do you think that that was kind of like a natural evolution? Do you think it was a forced issue? I mean, how do you feel about where Bitcoin started and where it is now? I think that's essentially the question.
Mm. Um, well, that's a really interesting question because I think what originally was the idea is still the core of where we are today, but we're seeing that take different shape and form. Like any technology,
Yeah.
the technology itself is agnostic. The utilities that you get out of it can only start existing after that technology is in place, and over time, people start to find new ways to use that piece of technology. Even if we look at internet as an example, I was having a call with somebody yesterday and we were talking about how the current time frame kind of feels like the internet in the 90s, where there's things to do, but really it's still so early on and we haven't had our mass adoption moment at all. There's still very few limited use cases with the technology, but the technology is here to stay. It's agnostic. It's just a piece of technology, and that's improved over time. And so, when Bitcoin first started, there was only one, and it was limited in what it could do, but the fundamentals were there. And what's interesting is that people looked at the fundamentals and started expanding on the use cases. And then what led to eventually smart contracts, Ethereum 2015. And then we had limitations there. But Bitcoin was always core. But there was a period of time where Bitcoin was, I wouldn't say in jeopardy of not being core, but there was definitely a period of time where that was more tumultuous for Bitcoin, whether it be block size, whether it be the capacity of the network. Bitcoin dominance has gone up and down over this the last 15 years or so. But I think it's only reinforced why Bitcoin was created and why it's so powerful and why it really is the king, and why I don't think it's going anywhere. And what's I think interesting in the last 2-3 years specifically, but I would say more so in the last year, very much so, is the pendulum switch back towards Bitcoin, where we've seen a lot of the application space, the DeFi space, NFTs, all leverage Ethereum. We're now seeing the pendulum switch back to how can we move Bitcoin from really just a peer-to-peer, more token transfer ecosystem to a value creation system. So Bitcoin is kind of catching up to the rest of the blockchain ecosystem, but now much stronger than before, because that's where all the liquidity is. That's where the security is. That's where you've got your foundations that led to the creation of all this, but decentralization, freedom, sovereignty over your own assets. All of that is still very much core, but now you have all these new building blocks and new use cases that you've seen are possible with the technology that maybe are not possible on Bitcoin, but that you can expand or you can leverage Bitcoin to do. And so I think it's really interesting to see that pendulum switch back and forth over the last 15 years. And it feels like this pendulum, let's say, swing that we're seeing right now is the first one of that kind in the last 15 years. So you saw basically people moving away utility wise, value creation wise, people moving away from Bitcoin onto layer 2s or Gen 2 or Gen 3 blockchains. And you're now seeing that come back full swing back onto how can we leverage Bitcoin? How can we expand on the functionality of Bitcoin? Because all that liquidity, those users are essentially trapped in there. But that's and by far, that's the first gateway in. That's the first door to entry to this overall ecosystem. I don't know if that really answers your question, but it to me, it really speaks to the nature of what the core fundamentals of Bitcoin are and how we've expanded on that. We're kind of coming back home in a way as a community.
Yeah, you answered the question very eloquently and quite colorfully. I think it's very much essentially TLDR. There's an evolution, and it's not about defining it as A or B. It's kind of going to change, and it's basically what's happening right now. And you guys, I mean, it gives me the perfect opportunity to then ask you the question: what's exSat? What are you guys doing in terms of where this pendulum is swinging at the moment?
Mm. So I mean, in short, kind of elevator pitch for exSat, it's a docking layer, it's a data availability layer for Bitcoin. We've seen a lot of layer 2s come about in the last year, especially like tremendous amount of layer 2s trying to expand on Bitcoin. We're trying to position ourselves in the solution that we're offering, and that's been built is kind of an in-between. So we call a docking layer, let's say layer 1.5. It's got that data availability component in the form of UTXO data. but then it's got that security, that robustness of the POW side of things that we're leveraging within our hybrid consensus mechanism. But then it also has the scalability and the flexibility of a traditional layer two in the form of POS, proof of stake. And the idea is, if you want to picture it kind of like a laptop, an actual docking station for your laptop, we're trying to in this example, connect to the underlying computer, but so that any or underlying peripherals and give you access to as many things as possible, but that any laptop can plug into it. And the idea is to service other Bitcoin layer twos or other applications that intend on leveraging Bitcoin as close to it as possible without necessarily bearing costs, the very real, direct, quite significant costs of what that would entail if they were to do it in a decentralized fashion as we're doing it.
So how does that look like from a working example? Can you illustrate, like, kind of like layman's terms, how does this thing actually work when you talk about communicating between other layer twos and the rest of it? What does that actually look like?
So the first thing and kind of the major thing is that we've indexed all UTXO, Bitcoin UTXO data, all 170 million blocks and counting. And that has a significant, very real, expensive footprint in terms of data storage. Now, you could store this on regular hard drives, for example, but the idea is within our solution, we store in RAM, actual hardware RAM in computers, so that it's easily accessible. It can be read from, and essentially that those RAM tables are multi-layered indexing state solution, so that you're able to query the UTXO data. You're able to impact the UTXO data. In layman's terms, you can have UTXO data or Bitcoin data trigger a smart contract. And so how is that useful? For example, right now, what we see with Bitcoin layer twos, they are not capable, or they don't, or they can't justify, because there's a very real cost to this, um, indexing all of the UTXO data in a decentralized open database. So right now they do it off chain. They do it in their own MySQL database. And obviously that reduced costs, but it goes away from the ethos of transparency and decentralization and kind of that sovereignty over your own assets that the Bitcoin network is really born out of and currently still provides. And that's in part why it's so valuable. And so we're bridging that gap by making that data accessible, queryable, triggerable. That's not a word, but you're able to trigger something with it if you push data. And that is a technical huge lift. It's very difficult to be able to do that. It's essentially taken us 6 years to be able to reach where the tech is capable of doing that. But also, very importantly, that from a cost perspective, we have a system that makes this financially viable and that abstracts that away from other layer twos. So right now, as I mentioned, other layer twos, just there's no financial viability to be able to provide the service. And so they just store it off chain, they store it themselves. The user in the end loses, or the user loses that function of having that decentralized transparency. We're bringing that back to the table without putting the cost on those L2s. And so that's the value that we provide to them. Think of it like an oracle, think of it like a data availability layer. It's a mixture of a bunch of different things to offset that cost and to bring about benefit. And then there's a whole economy around this on why that's viable. So we could get into that if you want, but essentially it's 6 years worth of work that led to this for this to be real.
I mean, obviously, like, one of the biggest challenges with Bitcoin is the speed and the cost. Like, so you've obviously provided a framework, from my understanding of what you just told me, that essentially almost fast tracks that process in many ways, and it allows you to obviously access the data a lot easier, a lot faster, and it sounds like it's a lot cheaper. But you still have the challenge of Bitcoin transaction speeds and obviously the Bitcoin network and the rest of it. Is that a problem for you guys? Is it a problem whereby you figured out a solution? Help me understand that dynamic, because obviously that's probably the biggest challenge and probably the biggest handbrake in the equation that is Bitcoin at the moment.
So there's a few things to unpack in what you said, and there's a few
The,
assumptions as well that I'll try to kind of, I wouldn't say correct because it's just to expand on. So
yeah.
for one, you mentioned the cost, and we've been able to, I forget your exact words, but we've been able to reduce the cost or absorb the cost. The cost is still very real. To be able to expand on the Bitcoin ecosystem in a decentralized, open way, there's a tremendous cost to do that. What we've been able to do, though, is that we're leveraging a Gem 3 Layer 1 blockchain that already has an economy around it, that has a resource called RAM that we're able to write to. And so the cost is already taken into account into this in this current already running economy. And so it's not an additional cost per se to this entire system that's already been built, that already has incentives at play. We're simply leveraging that function in terms, but there's a very real cost. So if you wanted today to replicate that, let's say you're starting from scratch, you want to replicate, you want to essentially decentralize UTXO data, you would need to launch your own new network. You need to find validators that want to produce on that network. You would need to figure out a way to incentivize them to do so. Likely you would have a token. You would now need to go list that token so that there's liquidity and that token is actually tradable and has value that can be not extracted, but let's say leveraged. You would need to figure out in terms of attack cost how that token or that network has a great enough value that it doesn't become a weak point in or a bottleneck in the security side of things, where if you were to attack that, you can impact the UTXO data and potentially have a system that that has a low security bar. So all of this has a tremendous cost. This is not something that you could just do tomorrow. This is only possible because we're leveraging a Gen 3 Layer 1 blockchain that has this asset called RAM that is a combination of RWA, because it's a real world asset. It is an actual piece of RAM in a machine. It's DePIN because it's running in a network. And so whether this validator or this node has it or that node has it, everybody must have it. And so if one goes down, it's irrelevant. It's completely decentralized. There are attack mechanisms against that network that are already in place, as in that network is already secure. It's already been running. There's already value to it. To attack it is extremely expensive or prohibitive, just like it would be to attack Bitcoin. So to replicate that has a tremendous cost. So I wouldn't say that the cost is cheaper. It's that cost is already being captured elsewhere, and we're able to leverage this without bringing on undue or extra hardship cost to that. And so it very much is the culmination of years worth of work. On the second side of things, in terms of performance, you mentioned the scalability limitations to Bitcoin, and that give or take 3 to 4 transactions per second. Part of why Bitcoin is so robust and it is so secure is in fact because it does not evolve very quickly. It changes very rarely. It's very difficult to impact change on the Bitcoin network. That is part of the value proposition of why it's so secure and why it's valued as it is. If you wanted to introduce at the core level or the protocol level of Bitcoin functionalities to be able to expand on that scalability, there are improvement protocols that have been suggested in the past, but nothing is near being implemented. Nothing's near being reviewed. Bitcoin moves extremely slowly. And so it is theoretically possible that that could happen in the future, but as far as we can tell, this is not happening anytime soon. So the only alternative that you have right now to be able to expand on that liquidity and aggregate, still try to continue aggregating that liquidity, but essentially make it available for people, is the L2 route. And that's what we're seeing people traditionally do. That's what we saw in the Ethereum space as well. But then there are challenges to that. So how do you go from a POW system that's incredibly robust and secure, and in part that's why people are there, to offer them a solution that they are comfortable using, that doesn't put their assets at risk, but also makes their assets available for value creation purposes, whether it be interacting with DeFi, NFTs, whatever it may be in terms of use case, that they can now do that, TradFi, etc., but leveraging the assets. And that's a very hard problem to do. And our approach to this was that hybrid consensus mechanism that I talked about before. This idea that if you can leverage the UTXO data in a way to be able to trigger smart contracts, that would be a viable route to do so. And others are going about that route. But in our case, we were also very much focused on that security point of view. So if you're going to have that UTXO data, if it's centralized, which is currently is the case for the L2s right now, that's your weak point. Just like any bridge that we see, or just like any, typically when there's a hack, we see oftentimes it's the linker that's the weakest point, and that's what gets attacked, and that's what causes damages. So that kind of removes this idea of centralization. So you want to decentralize it. But now the players that are decentralizing this data are now key to it. If it's just you and me decentralizing this data and we're not worth very much, then the attacker, even though we might be decentralizing, even though there's 10 of us, we're still the weakest point because there's just not enough value still. So what was the closest that we can think of? It was to get the actual people that produce the UTXO data, so the actual Bitcoin miners, to be able to mirror that data onto our network. And so that was the first challenge that we're going through. The closest we can get to replicating that POW is to get the exact same stakeholders. If they can mirror the data, and our system incentivizes them to do so, and they do so within a respectable period of time where you can validate this particular miner created this block within the last 72 hours, they're eligible to push and synchronize that data to us. You know that it's the same players because they were able to mine a block within the last 72 hours. That means they're of a certain size, they have a certain hash rate. We're talking about the largest players. The last 72 hours encompasses pretty much the 20 or so largest mining pools. So, they are the largest stakeholders that you could have at the table. And that's our model, to be able to then mirror that UTXO data. After this UTXO data is mirrored, then we wanted, now you're going from POW, you're mirroring it to something that now can be expanded. This is the kind of the L2 component, or the docking layer side of things. Now you have validators that need to validate this data. And what we see is oftentimes the miners that are synchronizing this data also see value in validating this data, but this data set and this pool of validators is larger than the miners. So we've got 21 validators that then can validate this data. They're incentivized to do so. They also have restrictions on who can be a validator, so we set a certain amount of Bitcoin minimum. And the third pillar of all of this is that we wanted, because I'm a Bitcoiner myself, I don't want my Bitcoin to be in anybody else's hands other than mine. But if I do leave it in somebody else's hands, typically what we see in terms of data is it's in a custodian, it's in an exchange, it's in somebody that has more to lose than to take my small share of Bitcoin, perhaps. And so maybe, a lot of it is going to be on chain and cold wallet. Maybe I'm comfortable with putting 1 Bitcoin in exchange, or in a custodian, or 10 or whatever the number may be. So that third pillar of our process is the custodian side of things, where even the network doesn't have access to your data. Eventually, it'll be a decentralized MPC solution at the protocol level. But in first phase, it really is just centralized in a custodian. So that if you have Bitcoin currently and you're valid and you want to be a validator, you stake it in the custodian. Oftentimes, your Bitcoin's already there, either because you are a custodian, so those are the people wanting to join as validators, or you're a miner, so you already have them in this custodian anyways. So your Bitcoin doesn't leave where it currently is. It's never in our possession. A wrapped version is then issued on the network, which then opens up the possibilities of being able to impact the network and do things with it. But your Bitcoin's already safe. And those 3 pillars are really what form the core component to be able to secure it, but also to be able to scale it, to open up the transaction throughput that's possible on Gen 3 Gen 3 layer 1 blockchain, but then also as much as possible keep the security, that robustness of POW and Bitcoin. And all of this is governed through the exSat token, which is replicating the Bitcoin launch. So a fair launch, no pre-mine. The exSat Foundation also does not have any tokens. There will not be any tokens. If we want to get them, we need to mine them just like everybody else. So the only way to get tokens are to synchronize data or to validate data, and eventually to be able to then purchase the token once there's going to be enough in circulation that there's a market that's created.
Well, there's so much to unpack in terms of what you guys have done. I mean, I know that there seems to be a whole lot of lessons learned on the proof of stake side of things, a whole lot of lessons that have been learned from the proof of work side of things. And it is kind of like the marriage of the best of both worlds from kind of like the approach that you've described. In terms of the relationship that we have with proof of work and proof of stake, miners with obviously interacting with smart contracts, how is that dynamic in play on a practical level? So, for example, if I wanted to set up a lend and borrow facility within the
Mm.
confines or in the context of what it is that you've described, how would that dynamic exist in terms of not only the validation, but obviously the practicality of having a
Mm.
lending and borrowing, and are they essentially
Mm.
on the network?
Good question. So all of this, one of the things that we wanted to replicate as well, or to make available, is that user experience side of things, which really Ethereum has won in that regard. And I don't mean Ethereum per se, but I mean ERC token standard, EVM standard,
Yeah,
basically, of all those libraries. And we see that that's where the majority of DeFi comes from. And so our solution is EVM compatible. So basically, as an application developer, or even as an end user, you would simply connect to MetaMask. You would deploy your contracts on the EVM. And so you'd be able to replicate the current use case that you already have, but being able to then access Bitcoin liquidity under Bitcoin's rules. And so, function that already exists and function that's been, tried and tested, and that you're comfortable with within a UI and a user experience point of view, that you're comfortable, whether you're a developer or an end user, you're already used to doing this in this way. So you still get this in this way, it just happens to be connected to Bitcoin liquidity in the backend. So that was very, very important for us as well, was to pair that up. As I mentioned, a layer 3, a Gen 3 layer 1 blockchain that has RAM as one of the core assets for DPIN and RWA, and that multi-layered indexing solution that's only possible so that you can actually impact the UTXO data, read it, write it, etc., because there's a tremendous cost to do so. But then doing so in a way that's also compatible with where we see the users are and where we see the use cases are, which are in Ethereum. And so through that EVM door, basically. And it really reinforces this idea of a docking layer solution. When you
yeah,
put your laptop in a docking station, that docking station has USB-A ports, USB-C ports. It has, now I'm going to date myself, but maybe it has VGA slots in the background, or maybe it has SLI slots in the background. It's got HDMI, it's got DVI. You don't need to worry that it's compatible with everything, so that you can just plop your laptop in whatever shape or form it is, whether it's old, whether it's new, whether it's made from HP or made from Dell. It doesn't matter. You just plop into that docking station, and now you get access to your extra monitors, you get access to your mouse, your keyboard, whatever. That's what we're aiming to offer as easily as possible.
so from a user experience, it's coming back to that. I mean, like, are you guys at that point where you've designed kind of like a wallet that allows for account abstraction without kind of like the the pain and suffering that obviously we've experienced over the last sort of 8 years? Or is that something that you guys are working towards? What does that look like? Because it seems like there's a lot of thought that's gone into this, clearly. I mean, there's a lot of like nice to haves which have now become reality by the sounds of it. Is that something that you guys have done? Where are you at
Well, I
with
guess I
that?
can give an update on kind of the progress. So our testnet's been live now for quite some time. We are working towards mainnet launch. One of the objectives that we had in that testnet was, and currently before launch as well, going back to kind of the pillars I mentioned earlier in terms of mining power. We currently have roughly 39% of the mining power of Bitcoin mirrored onto our network. The goal is to have over 51%. We're well on our way to track to 60% by mainnet launch. So that basically 60% of the miners, or the mining hash power, is contributing and synchronizing data to exSat. So that's a huge core function, because otherwise everything else is moot. The second point is then the validators need to have 100 Bitcoin staked to become validators. So we already have the idea is there would be 21 validators at launch. We'd already have the 2100 Bitcoin staked in essentially in custodians that then is mirrored on the network for TVL upon launch, which then opens up the possibility of there's 2100 Bitcoin to be able to impact on the network through whatever use case would connect to it. So those were the really the two main things to focus on. You talked about wallet integration and just kind of more of the user and experience. Our focus has definitely been on the B2B side. So it's been with the miners, the synchronizers, the custodians. But because of the EVM door that I mentioned earlier, the idea is if you're already comfortable with a wallet, our aim is to make it compatible with those wallets. So if you're already used to MetaMask as an example, it's compatible with MetaMask. So we're not offering you a new wallet and saying, come to this new thing that you now need to trust, you need to learn how to use. It's where are you currently using your assets and where are you comfortable? We'll make sure that we are compatible with that. And so that's very much our approach. One of the things that we're trying to work on that is in the works, it's not ready yet, but that we are definitely want to have in the future is the decentralized mining side of things. So right now, when you're contributing your hash power to a mining pool, the mining pool receives the actual rewards, and then the mining pool distributes those rewards to the proportionate hash power within the pool. But you as an individual miner are not receiving those rewards. One thing that we're working on with exSat is so that one of the validators is piloting this in the background so that you as an individual contributor to mining power would be able to stake your Bitcoin and receive your proportionate share directly without having to go through this middleman as a mining pool. And so it's this idea of a decentralized mining pool. So that's a different kind of user to the one you talked about right now, but we're looking at the various users within. The point was we're looking at various users within this whole paradigm, whether they be the individual miner, the mining pool, the custodian, the individual stakeholder, the person who actually wants to go and use DeFi, and we're trying to meet them where they are instead of imposing a new solution on them. And so we're talking about a lot of bridges. We're talking about a lot of connections to leverage what currently is to meet you where you stand instead of having you come to us. Because one of the things we've seen in the blockchain space in general is in terms of UI, UX, we still have a lot of space. We still have a long way to go. The user experience is incredibly poor generally. We don't want to add to that. We want to simplify that as much as possible.
I think, yeah, I mean, you spot on. I mean, it does come down to a user experience. That's why I was like, I mean, just in terms of the ambition behind this project, it wouldn't have been surprising for me if you had said, yeah, we're going to design a whole wallet. But it makes sense. Why do you want to, that's another very, very long bridge to try and cross, get people's trust and all that. So it makes sense that you do just incorporate, what is kind of the norm at the moment. Just in terms of the relationship between kind of like all these building blocks, essentially, the way that I see what you guys have got going here and have built are the different building blocks from, the RAM component, the exSat component, your validators and the whole thing. Can you give us a breakdown as to what those different components are? And then the most important part is like, where does the value proposition lie for users wanting to come into the space, whether they're validators, stakers of RAM, exSat? Yeah, just give us like your take on this, because you've built something, you built it for a reason. There's obviously value here, and I want to see whether we can get
that's
everyone
debatable,
out.
and that's what we need to figure out, whether or not there's value, right? Yes.
It sounds like there is. So I mean, yeah, let me know your thoughts on that. I mean, let's see if there is, but I'm pretty sure that there's a ton.
So one of the things that we see and that we go through every 4 years is the halving, and every time we go through the halving, obviously the mining difficulty doubles, and that has significant impacts on stakeholders within not just the Bitcoin ecosystem, because the halving has obviously repercussions in the entire ecosystem, right? But it is a challenging period every single time because the hash power needs to keep up. The difficulty becomes harder. We see mining pools drop off, just no longer meeting the threshold. And so we see miners having to change mining pools. I was in Nashville a few weeks ago at the BTC conference talking to a miner who recently, for the last, I don't know, 8 years or so, has been with a particular mining pool, and that mining pool just no longer meets the threshold where they just can't mine blocks anymore. They just never mine a block. So his mining power is just essentially going to waste. And so, he moved to a larger known mining pool, in this case, Foundry, the number one in terms of the computing and pool and Foundry always switch back and forth, but essentially the largest mining pools. And so for the mining pools, it's a challenge. For the miners, it's a challenge every time halving comes around. But even within that period of time until the next halving event, you've got a constant financial pressure that's being exerted on the stakeholders within the ecosystem to find new revenue potentials, revenue paths. And that's one of the things that we really had at this core, is how, going back to this idea, if we want to mirror this UTXO data, we believe that the closest people that could do this, that keeps the security as high as possible, is the miners themselves. Well, how do you incentivize those people? Right now, they are looking for ways to generate revenue. And so if they can contribute to something that is in terms of difficulty or in terms of workload incredibly small. So if the barrier to entry is very low as possible, and the reward potential is non-zero, then ideally they see potential value with almost no risk. That incentivizes them to come over, and that message is resonating with those miners and those mining pools, because they see a mechanism. Right now they're trying to find ways to generate extra revenue so that they can get more hash power to their pool. How do they do that? They incentivize more. They either give a bigger portion of the rewards, or they compensate those rewards with other assets and somehow distribute more rewards, basically. And the mining pools are having to do that right now. Otherwise they lose mining power, and if you lose your hash power, then you might not meet the threshold to even be able to mine a block, and so all that power goes to waste. You essentially have a cost with no reward. And so we see this constantly, and so mining pools are constantly trying to optimize, either be through new hardware, giving out more rewards, basically staying on top of their game. And we see ourselves inserting we see exSat inserting ourselves in that dynamic, whereby we offer an extra reward for very, very, very minimal work, so that the barrier to entry is incredibly low, and that can come offset your costs or add extra revenue. So that's what the miners and the mining pools get out of this right now. Another thing that we see when talking to them is, again, this idea of being able to attract more hash power to your mining pool. Going back to the person I was talking to who just switched mining pool, the mining pool might not necessarily have an incentive to do so right now. There's not enough pressure, or they just don't see it yet. They don't see the value proposition. But some of the smaller miners might see the value proposition, and they're currently contributing to a mining pool. And so one of the things we've heard from the mining pools is they say, if you know of miners that are currently mining for another mining pool, and they'd like to basically put their hash power and help contribute to synchronizing this data, if you can get them to switch over to our mining pool, that adds further justification as to why there's potentially value in the background here. And that can strengthen why we might, as a mining pool, want to synchronize data. Because again, we're only looking for the top mining pools. So you might be a miner, you might have hash power, you're not big enough to be able to produce a block in the last 72 hours. And so you have to contribute to a mining pool. Otherwise you just might not be able to participate, but you have enough hash power that you might have some leverage with the mining pool to help convince them, I'll even be able to attract more Bitcoin and I'll add more hash power to your pool as long as you participate in this. So there's multiple angles going from the mining pool miners side of things. From the validators, like I mentioned earlier, they are often also the synchronizers, because for a little, again, very small incremental piece of workload that you must do, you're pushing a tiny bit of, in the first part, you're synchronizing data, so it's a very, very small lift. In the second part, you're validating the data that you just pushed is in fact accurate. And as long as the network reaches consensus, so 15 out of the 21 validate that as well, then you get rewarded. So again, very, very, very low level of work, potential high reward. But even if the reward is more than zero, your cost is practically zero. So validators, miners, mining pools, they're incentivized through the tokens. The custodian side of things, they're interested because if we can convince people and people want to then stake in and participate in exSat, it can bring about more Bitcoin into those custodians. Custodians are also fighting for Bitcoin. They want more Bitcoin in their pools because then they can offer better rewards. They can have more stable rewards, more reliable rewards. They can have larger pools. They can attract more investment. Again, it's all financial. So we really try to trigger the financial side of things in terms of incentives, while at the same time, the technicality of it, if it's done in a way that's ultra secure, it also opens up the possibility for the players I just mentioned to also start leveraging their Bitcoin within this network. Think of kind of a Lightning Network payment as a solution type of thing. exSat will enable that. And so if you're also then able to control your Bitcoin, but then able to expand on its use cases, that's also an extra benefit that's not necessarily financial, but it is of utility that they're incentivized to do so. Or they're incentivized to participate in because of that. And finally, the end user, their value proposition is likely the easiest, but it's the least of the focuses right now as we're launching. It's because you currently have Bitcoin. It's already in an exchanger. It's already in a cold wallet. You want to participate in DeFi. You want to go use Aave, but you can't. You're stuck. You would need to convert your Bitcoin to Ethereum in order to be able to do so.
Yeah.
And now the value proposition to you is now you could actually impact your Bitcoin on a network that is secure, where your funds are still within your own control, your keys, your crypto, but you're able to leverage the function of DeFi or NFT or whatever value proposition that you have on your side at a negligible cost with high throughput. So the network, because it's running on the EVM, because it's Gen 3 layer 1 blockchain, the gas fees are negligible. There's no gas fee as if you were impacting on the Bitcoin network directly. So you're able to leverage and expand the asset, leverage the functionality or the value of the asset, but increase its functionality. And the idea from an exSat point of view is we really will focus on the B2B side of things. So on the PaaS, payment as a solution, Lightning Network side of things, that would be a B2C, exSat to the user directly. But where we see a lot of expansion will be B2B between exSat and layer 2s, Bitcoin layer 2s. So think of Ordinals, think of Rune. They currently index their data off-chain. We'll be able to provide that data to them in a decentralized fashion. There's no cost to them. Their users now benefit because that data is on chain, can be queryable. It offsets the cost that they currently have, even the centralized cost that they're currently bearing. So it adds value to their customer. They can get more customer in, more people interact with that application, whether it be runes, whatever that might be. And so it's a B2B that impacts the C. So there's multiple ways of going about this.
So that's the aha moment in this discussion for me, anyways. Like
Awesome.
that relationship between what you guys have built, EVM, and obviously other L2s and sidechains. Obviously there's a debate and a discussion that can be had with preferably a red wine in hand. But I think it would be, what is an L2, what is a sidechain, and how that works. I don't want to get into that now because I think.
Yeah.
But I
think
think
it's important. Like
yeah.
we're not trying to position ourselves as competitors to L2.
Yeah.
We're not calling ourselves an L2.
Yeah.
Part of it is also because I think I'm a little bit more purist in my definition of what an L2 is, and we can get into that if you really want. But this general idea is that we want to be, as I mentioned multiple times, a docking layer type of solution whereby all the L2s can come, it can aggregate liquidity in the backend for them, it can offload costs, it can increase transparency and robustness. And so it's just a benefit to them with very little to no cost. And so we're not trying to compete with them. We're trying to close the gap as we see it of liquidity being fragmented as multiple L2s come about. They're all essentially going their own way. There's security issues with that as well. So we're just trying to close that gap. We're not trying to compete with L2s. We're not calling ourselves an L2.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where that is obviously a really clever way of going about it. I think the challenge is getting that trust and getting that kind of like credibility, and that's just going to come with time.
And that's where the 51% hash rate mirroring data onto the network comes from.
Okay. So that's the reason why. I mean, it makes sense. It's
the same person that created the block is the one synchronizing the data. That's that's how we could mirror the data in as close as possible, replicating POW without it being POW. and kind of the downsides and scalability side of things of POW. But if it's the same
Great.
stakeholders,
Yes.
it's the underlying players that are securing the network. If you trust them and this side of things with your Bitcoin, then you've already made that jump. You've already
Yes.
accepted that. If you don't
Yeah, I
trust
mean,
Bitcoin in the first place, then you're not here. So it's kind of, yeah, it's irrelevant.
yeah, I mean, what I find really interesting about this, and it's kind of like kind of veering off to the left a bit, but it's what's really important about this for me is that, the halving makes things more difficult for miners, so maybe we've got 2 or 3 halvings where things are relatively okay-ish in inverted commas from a hash rate perspective and miners being profitable, but then there's going to come that threshold where it's going to land up being almost impossible to actually be economically viable.
Oh,
And then
there's a
how do you?
culling every time, for
There's
sure.
a culling every
We see it right
time.
now. I think it was
Yes.
yesterday, the day before, was the least profitable Bitcoin day. I'm not sure if it was in history, but in recent times. And it's just a question of time. We see culling, and we see every time the hash power reconcentrate into a few mining pools. It's like clockwork.
Yeah. And I think you guys, and obviously solutions like this and ideas around this kind of thing, it really does afford miners the opportunity to essentially like diversify what it is that they're doing, and obviously putting their hash rate to good use. And it'll be really interesting to see how that kind of develops over time. I don't want to I also don't want to get into that now, because I think that's also a whole incredible discussion on its own. I wanted to just essentially close off our chat today just around kind of like, once again, the value proposition. You guys have obviously got these tools now. Like, a lot of people, you know, get tokens going, and they essentially land up just being an aspect that doesn't really provide value to the network. Whereas you guys, I think, have thought long and hard around obviously exSat, and then, RAM and that dynamic, and staking it. Please give us a rundown in terms of, like, primarily we have exSat, then we have RAM. What's the dynamic? How is the value proposition around someone like myself who wants to get involved in the network? Um, what's that dynamic, and what does it look like?
Good. So yeah, we have been thinking long and hard about this, and like I said, it's somewhat of a culmination of 6 years worth of work within a particular product and expanding upon that underlying product essentially. And the two tokens at play are the exSat tokens and what will be called RAM X. Right now, it is in the form of RAM. But this general idea is that you're writing UTXO data to physical RAM. That RAM has been tokenized, and so those who are lending their RAM, so the actual data rows within the RAM itself, that you, if you are the holder or the owner of the tokenized RAM, technically the data rows belong to you as well. You can write to them, whether it be deploying smart contracts or adding rows to the data table, adding extra tokens, whatever. In this case, what you would be doing is writing UTXO data to it. So what you're doing in this ecosystem with the dynamics of it are that if you are holder of RAM, you can lend your RAM to exSat, and that will then afford you the underlying asset RAM that can go up and down in value because it is tokenized assets utility. And it already has a value, but it will also then afford you your proportional share of rewards generated by the exSat network. So when exSat tokens are being created in the same way that Bitcoin is, so it's 50 exSat per block, all fair launch, no pre-mine anything, no special allocation. So as the network basically creates tokens, the synchronizers receive their share, the validators receive their share, and those lending RAM receive their proportionate share as well. And so there's dividends that come alongside that. And what we've seen with the RAM token in the meantime is that is also increased in value significantly because it's an underlying asset that now has a fundamental use case for it. So it is very utilitarian in terms of a token. It's literal RAM, it's RWA. And so if it's consumed, if data is being written to it, it gives it actual value, just not speculative value. So we've got that side of things. And then the exSat token is the governance token that governs there's a RAM DAO because the exSat Foundation itself also is a holder of RAM. And so the RAM is being governed by a DAO, those that hold the RAM underlying this DAO. The exSat token is being essentially governs the validators and governs the network. So the validators, what I didn't mention earlier, is that not only do they need to stake a minimum of 100 Bitcoin to be a validator, they also need to eventually, once there are enough tokens in circulation, there's going to be an event whereby you also need to stake exSat tokens. And that's what's going to determine your ranking. So there's going to be a component of you must stake Bitcoin, you also must stake exSat tokens, and that allows for the POS governance side of things. So that token obviously will also carry its own value and value proposition. So those are, but that's currently non-existing. The way that people can get involved right now would be through the RAM token. If they see that this idea has merit, and if they see that they'd like to contribute that RAM and receive dividends from this network as fees are generated.
So you can stake your RAM at the moment and start earning fees as we speak. And then
yes. I'll leave it at a short yes. It's easier that way. Yes.
Okay. And then in terms of exSat itself, that's Mainnet Launch. When are you guys anticipating that process to come online?
Currently slated for end of September.
Okay.
And so we are frantically working towards that. As I mentioned earlier, we have a few targets that we want to hit before mainnet launch. One is the over 51% hash rate that's being mirrored onto the network. We're currently at 39, but well on our way to track to 60 before then. And then having 21 validators and having enough custodians whereby your potential of staking the Bitcoin is wide enough so that it's suitable for your particular jurisdiction and particular liking. What I mean by that is, for example, if you're in a particular region, there are some custodians that are approved and they're within those regulatory frameworks within Europe, within Asia, etc. We want to have custodians in every region. That way you're able to go through a custodian within your own region. Eventually, all of that would also be decentralized, and then it wouldn't matter anymore. But yes, those are the kind of three requirements that we want to have before we launch, on our way to launch at the end of September.
You know, there's been a lot of discussion on Twitter, and even like people at conferences complaining that there isn't enough innovation in the space. I'm actually going to use this discussion as an example for the fact that there's a tremendous amount of innovation going on. Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that with us. I'm completely blown away by what you guys have built and what you're building, and the ambition that you have around this. It sounds super cool. Definitely going to get involved. To people who are listening and watching, we did write an article on exSat. It actually came out a couple of days ago. I'll put a link down in the video, so go check it out. It really does break down this even further, just check it out. Thank you, sir. I really appreciate your time and the detail. I know that you've got an appointment now, and I really appreciate you taking the time out. Please excuse, you can use me as the reason why you didn't make it on time, but I really appreciate your time. Thanks so much for joining us and sharing. Like this, we could dismantle this for hours, so I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me on. If you've got anything else, you can check us out, exSat.network, or reach out to me at BigBeardSamurai. Thank you very much for having me on. Likewise, I could talk about this forever. I'm very passionate about this. Been working in this space for years, and so this is what I choose to wake up in the morning. I think it's awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for letting me share my passion.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, and you clearly are, and we do appreciate it. Take it easy. I'll let you go to your meeting, sir. Take it easy. Cheers.
All right, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please give us a like, subscribe, and turn the notification bell on for next time. See ya.